Welcome to Subject to Interpretation, a podcast which takes us deep into the topics that matter to professional interpreters. I'm your host, Maria Ceballos Wallis. So we're continuing our Founders Series, celebrating the 25th anniversary of the De la Mora Institute of Interpretation, recognizing the accomplishment of individuals and organizations that have shaped the T&I industry and are still sculpting its future. It's impossible to do this series and ignore the accomplishments and contributions of the ATA, the American Translators Association. Its inception in 1959, they have provided a forum and a platform for education, networking, advocacy, and licensing for translators and interpreters. So today we'll be talking with Elena Langdon. She's an interpreter and translator for Portuguese-English language combinations. We'll be talking about her 20-plus year career and how her 19-year affiliation with the ATA has been a key element in her professional journey. Welcome, Elena.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Well, it's a pleasure having you here. I'm going to begin with a brief bio of you to help us along and give our audience an idea of your professional trajectory. So, Portuguese-English interpreter and translator since 2000. We could say since the turn of the century. Anyway, ATA certified as a translator in Portuguese into English. You're a core CCHI, which is certification in healthcare interpreter. You have a master's in translation studies from the University of Massachusetts Amherst from 2005. You have been teaching translation and interpreting since 2005. You were the chairperson of the National Board of Certification for Medical Interpreters, a director of the ATA, and you have been on the boards of the National Council for Healthcare Interpreters and the New England Translators Association. Did I miss anything?
I think that's the bulk of it. Yeah, I've been teaching at different institutions and worked for a while supervising interpreters at a major hospital that's local to me. So that was another big professional experience that I got to do in the field. So I know when you said it's still difficult to think about like 19 years that I joined ATA and really started down this path of being a professional interpreter and translator, but I guess that's where it's at.
Well, you know, this seems to be a common denominator with our guests on Subject to Interpretation. You are a very busy lady with seemingly endless supply of energy and drive. How do you do it, and how do you keep on doing it?
Well, it's not always easy. There have been times where I've had to say no to certain things, but the field is so important to me, and I believe in being active in the associations, and that's where a lot of the extra work comes from. I think it's just so important for us to be recognized as professionals, and that's what the associations are for outsiders. And I'm one of those people who I like variety. I like change. Actually, I don't like things to be the same. And I've been living in the same place for 20 years now. And so I think I've had to search out other ways of changing, because until then I had lived in several places. I went to college in different places. I didn't stay when I moved back to the United States. I didn't stay in one place. So one of it is just that variety of work and people, and really meeting different people and getting to see all aspects of the profession, being able to have the opportunity to work in different fields of interpreting and translation. And it gives me energy. Like, I'm one of those people, I guess I'm an extrovert, or at least I get my energy from people and from relationships. And I definitely get my energy from learning new things. So I think that's how it all fits in.
So that we can get these two parallel tracks going, let's provide some background on the ATA. So the American Translators Association is the largest professional association of translators and interpreters in the U.S., with 10,000 plus members over 100 countries. Its mission this is according to their website, now I want to get your take on it, is to promote the recognition of professional translators and interpreters, to facilitate communication among its members, establish standards of competence and ethics, and provide members with professional development opportunities, and advocate on behalf of the profession. So how would you frame it?
That's it. I think that is a really good description. The one thing I'll say that has changed in the recent years is the membership has gone down a little bit. So we have about 8,700 members now. So still a very large number. We're still the largest association by far. But during the pandemic, and perhaps for other reasons, the membership has gone down a little bit, although I think it's a more active membership, which is a good thing. For me, the ATA has been all of those things that's mentioned in its mission, primarily networking and having a very solid and also renewable body of peers that I can go to for information, that I can go to if I want to work with a new interpreter in the booth, if I'm doing conference interpreting, or even a different assignment that I just can't take. And so I can recommend somebody that I know that I've met through the ATA and all of its events, and a source of support for when dilemmas come up, when questions come up about, how to behave or how to handle a client. I'm working on a new type of project. Have you ever done this? Have you ever done transcription that they're also requiring, timestamps, for example? And so then I'll go through my notes through something that I've learned at one of the conferences that was a more formal learning setting for transcription, for example, transcription translation. But then I can also send an inquiry to the WhatsApp group of interpreters and translators in the Portuguese Language Division, for example. Their email lists, I could send questions to the email lists, or just, send a message or a phone call to an individual and say, how do you do it? How should I charge for this? Or what are the parameters? Is this the kind of thing that maybe I shouldn't do and I should pass on to you because you've been doing it longer and this is really a little bit too out of my comfort zone? So that kind of, to me, that's what networking means. And, people talk a lot about networking, it's so important. And I think when we understand what networking can really mean, it's even more powerful than just this idea of like having a lot of names and business cards. It's really about having that close and deep relationship with other professionals, with your peers, with some of them, of course, who become good friends. And over the years, it's just amazing how these relationships have kept there, even for people that perhaps step out for a period of time of the ATA, or even the profession, and then they'll come back, and then it's like, oh wow. And just thinking back as to when you met someone. And I was thinking another thing about this was that it's a long game. So this idea of networking is a long game. You don't go to a conference and then get work from somebody you meet there, within a week, sometimes not even within a year. One of my really interesting interpreting jobs I got because of someone that I had met probably at least 10 years prior. She'd come into the profession after me. She'd come into the ATA after me. And, we were in contact. We work in the same language where we were in contact. I knew of her, but hadn't really had any immediate, I hadn't had any actually close interactions. I'm not even sure if we'd ever gone out, for coffee or a dinner or something at a conference. But she had this really interesting job, and she knew of me from social media and the ATA and other events, right? And she knew the work I did. She knew I was involved with other people, and she also knew that I was physically fit because of some of the posts I make on social media, for example, are not they're personal, and it's about the events I do. I also run and do triathlon and things like that. So she knew, and this job needed somebody who was physically fit in addition to being an interpreter. And it was really the result of that, of just being there, that steady presence, keeping a professional front at all times, but also not being just cookie cutter. Oh, look at me interpreting here, look at me interpreting there. But in talking about these other qualities, or aspects of myself, I suppose. And then, I landed this really amazing 2-week job with her and 2 other interpreters. So that's what I mean by a long game. It takes, it does take years, but then you get kind of exactly what you want, which is great.
Well, when you talk about the long game, if you want to be in the game, you actually have to invest, right? So you have to participate. You can't be a passive bystander.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And that's part of why I like to get really active with associations and be on the board or be on committees and, organize conferences, because it just keeps me really in the know and meeting more people behind the scenes instead of just kind of paying my dues. There are a couple of associations that I recently became members of, but I don't do anything with them. And it's like, they're not even, they're nowhere on my radar. And I am nowhere on those, those members' radars either, because I'm in a directory, I think, but it's not the same thing. And it really is an investment. And sometimes people think, oh, it's too much money, I'm not going to spend the money. Why do you spend the money on membership or on the conferences? And if you look at it, first of all, if you look at it from the point of view of what you make, it's a very small fraction. And a lot of work does come through these professional associations, a lot of them for interpreting, not just translation. And so even just being in that directory is worth it. And then again, through colleagues as well. But so it ends up being it's like basically one job, like one day of work that you're investing, maybe 2 if you look at everything that you spend on a conference, for example. And that's definitely worth it. And putting in the investment of money, but also time and dedication. I think that, as we were talking about before, that also gives me that feedback loop of energy, because I feel like I'm making a difference. I feel like I'm making a difference for the profession. And that is something that also really, really moves me. I want interpreters and translators to be recognized for the value that we have, for the amazing work that we do for others, especially in public service interpreting, sometimes known as community interpreting, where there are people who have limited English proficiency, and without professional interpreters, their interaction with society, when they're marginalized linguistically, their interaction with society is more limited, and their access to services is very limited and very unequal. And I think that it's through associations, it's through certification, it's through professional standards that we can reach more recognition as a profession and as individuals, and really see, for others to see the need for it. Because, for example, in healthcare interpreting, in even legal interpreting, and certainly things like in schools, which we're seeing a growth now in interpreting for spoken languages, there's still not enough recognition that you have to hire a professional. You can't just have someone who hasn't been tested for their language skills come in and interpret, and you certainly can't call the family member. All these things that we know, right? We know them really well, but how do you communicate to the outside world that that's the case? And I think if we can say, yes, I'm certified, yes, I belong to this association that has a code of conduct, that has a code of ethics, has standards of practice, and I abide by them because I'm a member and because I'm certified, that says one thing. It's very different. We still don't have licensing actually anywhere really for interpreting or certification. In the United States, we have certification. It's still not required by anyone though. So that's the next step for that kind of professional recognition is to get requirements by government bodies, by other, school systems, by other, healthcare systems, that you need this person to have some kind of credential for them to do the work, right? If you think about a hospital system, which is the majority of my experience up until I'd say 5-6 years ago, was in healthcare interpreting, and that's where I invested just a lot of time and associations as well, and interests and teaching and all of that. In healthcare interpreting, if you think about a hospital system, almost everybody there has some kind of credential, even from the medical assistant on upward. Almost everyone, people who are serving food in the kitchen, have a certification, right, for food safety and all the other important things that go on there. There's very few individuals working in a hospital system that don't have anything, and interpreters, and that don't have any requirement, I should say. And interpreters are one of them, and it just doesn't make any sense. What we're involved with in a hospital is just as important as all those other professionals, and there should be that. So that's one of the things that's always been the goal with certification, for the different associations that do it, is that eventually for it to be required. With American Sign Language interpreters in the United States, you cannot work in most settings unless you have certification. And if you can only become certified as an ASL interpreter if you have a college degree. We don't have any of that yet. So that's what we see as the future for that increased professionalization. And the associations are a key part of it, because the associations can communicate with the higher powers, so to speak, and unify us and make us a more cohesive group, that now it's not just me, Elena, the interpreter, saying, oh yeah, you shouldn't do this, or even me as the supervisor of a hospital. It's really not that much power. What has a much more power is money and liability, and so getting us associated with the risk. And that's when you can say, well, if the person's certified, then we're lowering our risk. We're lowering our risk of getting sued, and even more importantly, we're lowering our risk of doing harm to patients.
So as a manager in a hospital of interpreters, and was the ATA something that you talked to your employees about? For example, how did you first become aware of the ATA? Why did you decide to join, and have you used that as a launching point to recruit other members?
So yeah, I first became aware of the ATA probably through the New England Translators Association, which is a local organization. It's not affiliated with the ATA, but a lot of the members there are ATA members as well. And that's the first conference that I went to. So I had been at the beginning of what I call, my professionalization, because I had interpreted in college for one person, kind of ongoing, who had some medical needs and was from Angola, but who knows what I was doing. I remember he had a shoulder injury, and that was the bulk of the appointments were about this shoulder injury. And I never even looked up, like, what are the muscles or the bones and the tendons. I don't want to think about what I did for that. And I had translated a lot of things for my mother and her students, because I grew up in Brazil, but my mother's American, and her Portuguese was, she needed a lot of revision for it at the time. And then her students were writing in English, and they needed, revision or translation. So I had done it, but I don't consider myself a professional. And so I had been living in Brazil again as an adult, and that's when I started working in translation. And I was working for the state certified translator and interpreter, which of course in Brazil is regulated and much more regimented. And there's a table with the prices that you can charge as a state certified translator for certified translations. And, you can't charge more or less than that if the translation is official, which most of them are. It's that kind of a place, like most of South America or most of Latin America. And she took me under her wing. And I started translating for her. And I'm giving you these very long answers, which is just the way I am. And you can edit out what you need to edit out. But she was the first one that kind of planted the seed for me to come to the United States and study more and for work as an interpreter. Like I said, I like change. And in where I was living in Brazil, there was only so much I could do as a translator, which was I was mostly doing translation. I did one interpreting job there as well, but it was mostly translation. I come from a much smaller town, not from São Paulo or Rio or anything. And, I was translating all the tourism books because I grew up on an island. So there's a lot of tourists. So I translated like all the books about the beauties of the island and the state. And I did a book on natural birth, and then I was doing all the official translations. So anyway, I wanted to go further, and I moved back to the United States. I moved to Massachusetts and looked up an association because I hadn't belonged to any in Brazil for those 3 years that I was working. And so I joined the New England Translators Association, went to a conference, and at that conference, I met Arlene Kelly. She gave a presentation about a day in the life of the interpreter. And it was a great presentation. It wasn't even about the specifics of like, this is consecutive, this is simultaneous. It was, she's a great presenter. And it was, kind of like navigating Boston and Massachusetts with the weird signage and the old streets and really like, this is what a courtroom looks like. Not what you think. It doesn't have the pillars, it looks like it could be like a social club or something. And I talked to her afterwards because she's a Portuguese-English interpreter. And she said, you should join the ATA. And she said, in fact, we have an event for the Portuguese Language Division in Rhode Island in, I'm going to say 2-3 months. Whatever. The timeline, I can't quite remember, but it was right around then. So I went to that event. And so then I met, and it was, maybe 50, 100 people were there. So now I met the interpreters and the translators that were in my language pair. And it was just like, oh, wow. So meanwhile, I had started doing my master's in translation studies, and I was in a very small program. So it was me and actually 2 other women, one of them from Switzerland and one of them from Argentina. And we drove in my Ford Festiva from Western Massachusetts to Toronto. It was the year where the ATA conference was international. And then it's like an 8-hour drive. And we drove there as students. We got, student prices to join the conference, and I got hooked. I'd never really haven't left since.
It's interesting that you bring up certification as an important part of the ATA. And first, I want to make a clarification. I think I stated at the beginning of the episode that the ATA provided licensing, and I want to make sure that I correct myself, because in fact, certification and licensing are not the same thing, although hopefully one day they will kind of be hand in hand, one in the other. But the ATA in particular it provides certification for 18 languages from English and then 16 languages into English. And that is really far more than any other testing or certification available, including court certification interpreting. So when you and I were speaking earlier, prior to the podcast, we talked a little bit about the importance and perhaps how that ATA certification can be helpful for speakers of languages other than, Spanish, French, etc., who can be tested at the very least in terms of their language ability in translation, and that'll give their career a bit of a, let's say, a backbone, or their resume, or their people know that, if you can pass an ATA test, which is extremely rigorous, then with additional training at interpreting, then you've got the two things that an interpreter needs, which is language acquisition skills, the fluency in a professional level in both languages, and then the interpreter skills. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I think that's also been a benefit to you.
Yeah, certainly. And it's also changed. So I'll talk a little bit about what the ATA has now done specifically for interpreters and in terms of certification or credentialing. So getting certified as a translator, and it is directional, as you said, so it's Portuguese into English in my case. And I could take another exam and try to see if I get certified in the other way, but I quickly realized that I didn't need it and didn't feel the need to pursue it, because a lot of my clients, that certification was enough. And even though you always put what the direction is, I often did translations into Portuguese as well. Not official ones, but just given the level of immersion that I had with the two languages, when I was actively translating all the time and engaged with the two languages all the time, I was translating both ways, and a lot of stuff was into Portuguese for for a long time. And it was really, I think that for most of the clients really showed that I had, again, like you said, the language abilities, and being able to translate well is definitely a high indication of your language skills. It's not an indication of your interpreting skills, but it, like you said, it shows that it shows that you have the language, and it shows that you can convert a message, at least when you have the time and in writing. Although the test is actually timed, and you don't have all the time in the world, and you can't look up. You couldn't at the time that I took it was handwritten test. And so we could bring in dictionaries, and I remember somebody like rolling in a suitcase, because you used to take it as a group in a room. And it was, I think, 2.5 hours or something to translate two passages, which seems like, oh, that's tons of time. But of course, you got to translate it and revise it, and you only have the resources that you bring with you. But now it's changed. So now you can do it online, and I think you can consult some websites. But I'm digressing again. So with certification, it did show that I had that, and people were really impressed with it. Then, and this was before any kind of certification other than court, for interpreting. And even court interpreting certification, like federal certification, only exists in 3 languages. In practice, I really think it's only Spanish. There's a consortium, right, for multiple languages, and depending on the state that you're in, you can belong to that more or less easily. In Massachusetts, Massachusetts is part of the consortium, but things are not well organized, and there's been in the past, there's been a lot of mismanagement of that. So you couldn't even get certified, couldn't be labeled certified as an interpreter in Massachusetts for a long time. So there was really nothing for that. And then 2009, things changed for healthcare interpreting. And I sat for the exam that I could sit for Portuguese. But what the other thing that the ATA started doing, and this was through a committee that the ATA has, which is called IPAC, and we changed the name recently to Interpretation Profession Advisory Committee. It used to have the word advocacy in there. And this is a dedicated group of individuals who have done a lot of really good work for interpreters within the division and for the profession, within the association, rather, within ATA and for the profession. And one of the things that they did probably about 6 years ago, I'm going to say, was, after a lot of years and a lot of work, is that they brought what we call credentialing to ATA members who are interpreters. And they came up with a really good program. So it's not a certification exam that's ATA, that's for interpreting. That was also discussed over, all this time, the last 20 years. And in the end, I think, and I think it's mostly the right decision in the end to try to create a general interpreting exam. It would be a very laborious process. And then at the same time, there was also this discussion of should certification be separate from a membership organization, because that's usually how it is in a lot of professions, and including with healthcare interpreting, right? The certifying body is not a membership association, and the ATA is a membership association that has a certification arm, and then they also certify. So with this credentialing process, interpreters can use the credentials that they've acquired elsewhere, as long as they meet the criteria, and it's a very solid, robust criteria. And then they will be called credentialed interpreters within the ATA, and they'll be listed in the directory as credentialed. And it has equal weight as a certification as for a translator. So when a client is looking for an interpreter on the ATA directory, they can filter that for those who have credentials. And the credentials are federal certification as a court interpreter, state certification as a court interpreter. The few states that have state certification programs for medical interpreting, like Washington and I believe it's Oregon, that would count also as to be a credentialed interpreter. If you're CCHI certified with the performance exam. So my certification didn't have until 5 months ago a performance component for Portuguese. So I can't be credentialed in the ATA category of it, which of course I'm not personally, I'm not very happy about it, but it makes sense. There's, all I took was a knowledge exam. I didn't take a performance exam for CCHI. And then anything else that has, so IEC interpreters, the International Association of Conference Interpreters, if they're a member, which means they passed a very rigorous process, they can be considered credentialed under the ATA. So this is all to say that the ATA established a way to credential interpreters and recognize that they had gone through a standardized, robust credentialing program, often certification. IEC is not certification, but it's a even more rigorous qualifying membership. You can't be a member unless you've been reviewed by 2 or 3 people and you've worked with them multiple times. They've heard you interpret. And it's a way to recognize what they've done elsewhere and give them that same credential that the translators within the organization have. And that's been really important to people as well. And so I think a lot of people don't realize that. And a lot of people don't think of the ATA as an organization for interpreters, but it really is. And there's thousands of members who are interpreters. I was looking at the numbers right now in the Interpreters Division, which is still just, you choose to be in the division. So it doesn't mean that there aren't more, but in the Interpreters Division of the ATA, there's 2,500 members. That's a lot of people, 2,500 interpreters just in that division. There seems to be in the directory 3,300 interpreters. Now, again, not everybody's in the directory, although most people are, because for a lot of us, that directory is another main reason to be in the organization. And there's this committee that's devoted to furthering the work of interpreters within the organization and in the outside world. And it's always been for me in my language pair, but I'm not alone. There's a lot of interpreters in the divisions. So I've met some of my better experiences have been my better networking experiences that don't lead to work have been meeting interpreters in completely different language pairs at the ATA conference and having, wonderful conversations and hearing about the type of work they do. And having, again, just that broader group of people who are keeping us united and keeping the standards high and delivering, really important work for people who really need it. And it's throughout the association, the Portuguese Language Division, the Spanish Language Division, I think now is led by an interpreter and often has been led by interpreters. I've met there's a lot of Japanese interpreters in the association. The woman that's a really good colleague now does Dutch interpreting, so it's everywhere. It's not just Portuguese or Spanish.
So of course, this begs the question, why is it still called the American Translators Association, right?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, people have definitely proposed to the board that the name be changed. The board has considered it multiple times and, put it to a vote. I don't know if it's been put to a vote by the membership. That would be a good question for the ATA. But I think given that it's the name, it's also one of those things that you don't, to change the name of the association might not be in the bylaws, that it could be done by the membership itself. But they've come close to changing it, but always ultimately decide not to, just to keep the historical name, right? Because it is such an old association, such an established association. But the tagline is the voice of interpreters and translators. And I remember being part of that discussion. Is like, when we have this tagline, it was very deliberate to put interpreters first before translators, not because interpreters are better, but because to try to change this image that the ATA is only for translators. And to a certain extent, the other thing that I feel about that is that in some languages, there's only one word, right? And in the broader world, people continue to refer to us interpreters as translators. So from that perspective, it might not make such a difference from that. I would like to see the name change personally, but I understand that there are other things to consider, and that perhaps just keeping that historic name is just as important.
Well, I appreciate the clarification because, of course, there's lots of people who have always, maybe not lots of people, but I've heard people at some point comment, well, why do I need to be a part of that organization? It's a translators organization. It's not an interpreter organization. And there's a lot more layers to that, to the organization, with the divisions and the committees, which include interpreters. Now, in your trajectory and your participation in the ATA over the last 19 years, you have been chair of the Interpreter Policy and Advisory Council, which now has a new name, right?
Yeah, so IPAC is interpretation, and I have to look at my notes. Even though I was part of renaming it. We wanted to keep the acronym, so we're like, how can we keep the acronym but have it? So it's Interpretation Profession Advisory Committee. It's a committee.
Okay.
Yeah.
And tell me how that functions and what role they play within the organization.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's one of the committees. And so committees can be standing committees, which are in the bylaws. And there's a few of those, like the ethics committee, I think governance committee, the executive committee. These have to exist. And then there's several other committees that report to the board of directors, and that we have created new committees over the years, such as the advocacy committee, which was created maybe 3 years ago, to really put, again, kind of advocacy at the forefront of what the ATA does for the profession, for translators and interpreters. So you can create these new non-standing committees can be created and eliminated, but that hasn't really happened. And they are small groups of people. They're led by a chair, and then you have a group, usually, well, it depends on the committee, but I think it varies from probably 5 to no more than 8 or 9. And they report directly to the board of directors. So every quarter, when the board of directors meet for their meeting, the chairs of each committee have to submit what they've done over the last quarter. what their numbers are, what their projects are, any problems, any new members have to be approved by the board. If there's a change in leadership, that has to be approved by the board. And the committees in general advise the board of what they see as issues that are coming on that the ATA can take on, and further advocate or further try to change for that part of that specific committee. Some of the committees are more for functioning of the organization. So for example, the ethics committee is a committee that people can go to when they feel like there's been a client has breached they have some ethical problem that the client has had, or really the opposite as well can happen. So if someone feels that a member of the ATA has violated the code of ethics, they can go to the ethics committee and they'll do an investigation and see if the member has indeed violated the code of ethics and what the repercussions would be. There's a strategy committee, right? So these are committees that are doing the work of continuing the work of the board of directors. But then there's committees such as IPAC, which are specifically dedicated to taking part of the membership or an issue with membership and promoting it further and doing services. So like I said before, one of the things that IPAC did was credentialing. Another one was to write a white paper about remote interpreting, and also come up with one of the things that IPAC has been working on is coming up with a model contract for interpreters, because ATA has a model contract for translators, but not for interpreters. And of course you can adapt it, but it would be nice to have one that we would put out there. Another thing that IPAC has been doing is, again, communicating and advising to the board when they feel that it's important for the ATA to speak out against or for something that's happening with interpreters across the country. So let's say in Massachusetts recently, there was a really big problem with court interpreters and the administrators, and court interpreters were striking. They were seeking better conditions, and they have made some gains. And I think part of it is because they were supported by the ATA and other organizations, right? So now you have a group of state interpreters who are getting support from the ATA, a national association. And so it's not even IPAC sending a letter as a committee, it's the ATA with 8,700 members and 64 years of history, and all of that. So it has a lot of weight. So IPAC looks out for those kind of issues. I think it was AB5 that happened. We were joking, right, that we couldn't remember the number, but I think it's AB5, the law in California.
There's also AB42, which was the California Court Interpreters Workforce Pilot Program bill. That was another one as well. But AB5 was also about the freelancers and the contract workers as employees.
Right.
So the ATA, I mean, I was looking through their website, and anybody who's interested could see the different letters of support and the different documents. For example, there was a letter supporting Nebraska court interpreters.
Yes.
In their efforts to earn fair compensation. I think there was also something to do with Colorado in the last year, as well as a joint amicus brief for remote interpreting with NAJIT, the National Association of Judiciary Interpreters. That is far smaller, but more specific to legal interpreting. One thing I wanted to talk to you about was the ATA compensation survey. That's a tool that's available to members only. Does that also inform members about interpreting rates? Or interpreter compensation, or is it only for translation?
That's a good question. I am pretty sure it does have interpreter rates, but I can't be sure. But I think now it is included. It should be.
and that's exclusively a members only benefit. So if you want to know what the ATA has to say about compensation, then you really do have to be a member of the ATA. You can't just click on it and expect to get that information.
Right, right.
So in addition to this whole the focus that the ATA has been putting on interpreters, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about a post-COVID world for I guess for interpreters and translators. I think that it's probably universally known that translators have historically mostly worked remotely.
Right.
They might work, freelance, some may be on staff, but in for the most part, they work remotely, and they work in combination and in teams and in concert with other translators all over the world, whether one's a project manager, a proofreader, translator. And so that there has been this kind of collegiality in terms of translators, which probably has been promoted by the ATA and reinforced by the nature of the way that translators do their work. So here we fast forward right to COVID, and it's not that remote interpreting or virtual interpreting. I heard one of your podcasts talking, Catherine Allen, about what is the right nomenclature for whether remote, virtual, RSI, et cetera, but not getting into that. We know that the future always held that interpreting would have some kind of an electronic platform at some point. We just and many like Kudo and other types of RSI platforms existed before the pandemic, but I think the pandemic really kind of ushered in a new age very, very quickly, especially with the commercial apps such as Zoom and WebEx. So talk to me a little bit about that, because it feels to me like there's a little bit of a revolution going on in the world of interpreting, and in perhaps how interpreters could take advantage of what the ATA has been doing so well for so long for translators.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, it definitely has been a very big shift in how we work and how we work together, but separately. So like you were mentioning, it's a great analogy that translators used to work together, but they weren't in the same place. One person often did the translation, then they had their revisor, their editor, and it would come back to them. And so they're working in concert regardless of where they live. And with interpreting, that really didn't happen. That kind of working together with somebody, even though we've had remote interpreting as over the phone interpreting for at least 35 years, and video interpreting to a certain extent, video remote, which was consecutive interpreting to a certain extent, but people weren't working together, right? So you're a phone interpreter, you're just working yourself, you take a call by yourself, you're not handling it, and it's not simultaneous. So there's been this really big shift in how interpreters work together, and also how clients and agencies can harness the work from interpreters regardless of where they are. And the positive upshot of that for that is that you can provide more access to more people. So it's possible for you to get an interpreter for a language let's say in Colorado, that there's not a single interpreter who speaks Hmong, but there's a lot of interpreters that work with Hmong and English in Minnesota, right? So now with remote interpreting, you can get a professional Hmong interpreter who is not going to get just that one job in Colorado that one day. They're going to work, all over the country. And it's really, that's the positive side, right? There's a lot of negatives, and I don't think we have to go over all of those now. But the but having an organization like the ATA backing us up and keeping us as a network of professionals, again, talking about keeping the standards, which are still not set in stone anywhere. So is it a 1 hour minimum? Is it a 2 hour minimum? How long should an interpreter be interpreting alone remotely, right? Is it a 1 hour job? Is that okay to be alone? Not really for simultaneous, right? Numerous studies have shown that that's too long. Is it an hour alone one day and then you don't work at all the rest of the day? Okay, well, how much do you get charged? How much are you going to get paid for your preparation for that? Can you make a living with doing that? And the answer is usually no to all of those. So then if you're doing a series of 1 hour in simultaneous interpreting jobs during the day, you're going to be exhausted. And again, you've got to fall back to that where it's team interpreting. It's, at least two people interpreting and you're going back and forth. But being that we're in a capitalist system where it's all driven by profit, there's a lot of companies have stepped in and tried to, that's what they're looking at. And they will try to reset those standards. And if we're not careful and if we're not staying united and bringing more people into associations so that they can learn more and that they can stay up to date with all the skills and knowledge, but also just with that idea as a parameter, and putting yourself as a professional and not really not succumbing to this gig economy idea where we're just pieces and we can just like, oh, I'm just gonna interrupt my day, not interrupt, it's not even an interruption, right? I'm just gonna, I'll just run up there and do a little interpreting. I'll do a little interpreting over the phone. That's not the case. But there's so many, because the bar is still very low for entry. It's a very, there's no licensing, there's no requirement for certification or credentials. There are a lot of people that are coming into the system with very little knowledge of how it works. And so the quality suffers, but even more, it's the fees, right? The rates and what people are charging and getting paid, and then the working conditions. So organizations that are looking out for the profession can really help with that and keep us, again, all talking to each other, putting out white papers, putting out recommendations, presenting, teaching. So I think another really important part of the ATA and my participation in it has been all this knowledge that I can then talk to my students about, and just right off the bat, these are the standards that the associations have been trying to uphold for all these years. And, you as a new person are going to do the same, and you're not going to go out there and charge, $15 to do, a deposition.
So, Elena, you started teaching shortly after you started your master's, and also during the time that you've been with the ATA, you have, done presentations, taken courses, given courses, but you also took a little time, I'd say somewhere, and you mentioned this a little earlier, but I wanted this I wanted to highlight this a little more. You also took some time in 2009 and 2010 to dedicate to the certification of medical interpreters. And I think that's important. What I want to know from that is, having had, all of your ATA experience prior to that time working with the Portuguese division and bookending it later with being on the board of the ATA. Can you talk a little bit about, that journey that, the ATA has informed, your trajectory in advocacy and in advancing the profession, and, then probably, those, side trips, such as the work with CCHI, and whatnot, is probably also then further informed the next level work you've done and the ATA.
Yeah, it again, it was kind of, I mean, getting what I didn't realize at the time was that by joining from the beginning, the ATA, I was joining the oldest, most, to a certain extent, most organized and certainly most robust national association for a large group of translators and interpreters, regardless of field, right? So without that specialization, because as you mentioned, NAJIT is a very robust association, but it's specifically for judiciary or legal interpreters and translators. And I didn't really realize that at the time. So I joined it, and then I started volunteering for other organizations and trying to bring some of that to them, and realizing that it takes a lot there's a lot that goes into being a membership professional organization. It takes more than just wanting to do it. It takes more than just good intent. And there have been some ups and downs with some organizations because there hadn't been that solid foundation. So I had been on a couple of different boards of directors, and then I became, and then I went to the ATA, and it was like a whole different ballgame. And I was like, okay, this is how a board meeting is run. This is what has to happen. And it takes a lot of work behind the scenes. I mean, ATA does have employees, their headquarters has staff that are getting paid, and they're doing so much work. The board of directors is also doing so much work in the back end that a lot of people don't see just throughout the year. In those meetings, but outside of those meetings, and setting the direction of the organization, and with that, trying to keep advising and steering the profession. It's just been it's been very eye-opening, and it extends to trying to really understand how to do other things like project management. When COVID hit, I had already been working in remote interpreting, and I started a small business with two other colleagues, and we were focusing on remote simultaneous interpreting. This is in 2019 that we formally came together. And so we were really well set when the pandemic hit. And we were kind of at that forefront where we were looking at different different platforms, and Zoom was doing it, but of course Zoom is 20 times better now at doing simultaneous interpreting. But I think it informed all of that, and just really it allowed me to advance in my career in other ways. So I could see systems from that kind of higher level and what you needed to run this kind of a program. I briefly stepped out of the field last year, and I was hired as a event and webinars producer for a small nonprofit that had contracts with the government and had nothing to do with translation or interpreting. And I was looking for a full-time stable job, and I was like, well, I can do this, because it was primarily in Zoom, and all these things that I had learned through being on associations, looking at how groups of people can work together or not, helped. And then producing events in Zoom, because I had all this experience interpreting, it was like I could really, I could jump onto something else. And then, of course, what happened was that I got recruited out of that back into the world of interpreting and translation, which is what I'm doing now. But and I'm very happy. It was the 9 months that I was not working in the profession as much I'm glad that it was just a pause. I'll say that. I'm glad that it didn't become a second profession, because for me, I want to be doing this the rest of my life. And I want the the associations and I want the ATA to be there so that I can do that, but more importantly, so that other people can do it, and so that we can keep, again, doing this really important work of providing language access, helping people communicate, regardless of language, regardless of cultural background, connecting people, which is just such an important thing in this world. And as we become, it's not as we become, we are completely now remote as a society, as a global society. And yet the barriers are still there. We have to be really careful, really, really careful with the use of AI, or the over-reliance, right, on AI, because so much of what we do as interpreters cannot be done by a machine, cannot be programmed, right? Nothing is done by the machine. It can't be programmed into, a series of zeros and ones. It's just not, there's too many possibilities. The richness of language, the richness of communication, and even as you're communicating, if you look at communication theory, as you're talking to someone, you're establishing the meaning as you go, based on feedback, based on a series of things, based on context, based on expectations. And you can't give all of that to a machine. I know that there's a lot of people that think that interpreters are going to be replaced by AI in a few years, but I really disagree. And I think the associations can help us keep the human in the loop.
Well, on that note, Elena, thank you so much for being an advocate for translators and interpreters equally, for all the work that you've done, educations, sessions that you provide, and mentoring that I know you've done over all of these years. Would you do anything differently?
I don't think so. I've been really, I feel so grateful. I feel so happy to be able to do what I do. And I feel, there's the personal gain, but it's more than that. It's just the ability to have this large group of people where we're all working towards the same thing, speak in all different languages. And I don't think so. I'm not a long-term planner. I really am one of those people who kind of takes things as they come. And I've tried to be strategic. Oh, what's my 1-year plan? What's my 5-year plan? For me personally, it doesn't work, and I don't need it, because I've been so lucky to have built something without the planning. And no, I don't think I would have done anything differently. I'll say one thing I would have done differently, and I do want to say this as a woman and as a mother. There were that period of 2009, I was a new mother, and I did not take enough of a break. And so I took a break from my full-time job, and I was working full-time at the beginning of certification, and I was running all kinds of things in the background, and it was incredibly stressful. And I was nursing my baby, and that I regret. I had all kinds of personal health problems, and I should have just said no. I'm a new mother, and this is what I'm going to do for now. I don't need to add all of these things. So I'm not a regrets person, but that I would have done that differently. And I say that because I think it's important for people to hear, we can do a lot, and especially women do so much, and we're so powerful, and we multitask really well, or we do multiple things at the same time really well. And we have so many important roles, but we also have a lot of pressure to do it all. And ultimately, you have to think of priorities. And it's not been very much, but there have been short periods in my life where the priority was work, and it should not have been.
Well, going back to the long game, Perhaps you don't have to have a 1, a 5, or a 10-year plan, but certainly know that it is a long game and that you can incorporate different facets in your life, such as, having your children, taking care of your children, without it necessarily meaning that you're never going to go back and be an interpreter, that
Yeah.
you're never going to go back and be a translator. As a matter of fact, I would probably say, and I don't necessarily have any scientific evidence to back this up, but I think experiential experiences and other people's experiences over time would agree that with translation and interpreting is one of those few jobs that over time, your level of experience, your level of what you have learned in life, including how to deal with people, small children, including and all of your life's experiences actually contribute to making you a better professional down the road, just across the board. And not to fear that there may be times when you need to take a little detour, but this industry is going to be there for you no matter what, because we need experienced, dynamic professionals in all of those.
No, for sure. And also, and I think even the opposite is true too, that or not the opposite, but the counterpoint of it being a professional and being engaged as a professional makes you a better parent, makes you a better or even better partner, better member of society. My mother was, she still is an academic and worked a lot. And I now see all that she did, when to me, she was just a mother, but she set the bar high, and she set a really good example of being really dedicated to her work and really dedicated to her family, and not really having, and it was there for her too, both those things. And she gets both rewards, and it's a big reason as to why she was such a good mother as well. So it's not even like it's not one or the other. But yeah, I definitely agree. It's a good profession to take chances on, to try new things, there's a lot of room. You can specialize in different things, or you can, take a break and do only one side of it, do something that's going to allow you a little bit more flexibility. There are in-house positions, and then there's a lot of freelancing. And so it's just a matter of setting the priorities and setting your boundaries.
So Elena, why don't we catch up in a couple of years and see what else you have been cooking up?
That sounds great.
Thank you so much for joining us here on Subject to Interpretation. It's been a delightful conversation, and thanks again for all of your knowledge and expertise.
Of course. Thank you. It's really great to be here, and thank you again for having me.
To all of our viewers and our listeners, thank you so much for joining us here on Subject to Interpretation. We value your comments, so please, if you're watching this on YouTube or you're listening on a podcast platform, please just drop us a line. Let us know what you think. Let us know if you're interested in any other specific topics, and we will make every effort to cover them. And also, I wanted to remind you that the De La Mora Institute of Interpretation has a members platform, which you can join, with monthly webinars and lots of resources. So don't forget that you can just join us on delamorainstitute.com. And just, if you have any questions, info@delamorainstitute.com. We would be happy to answer those questions for you and have you join our teams. Thank you very much, everyone. Never stop learning.